The case of Lote versus New Orleans, the origins of Storyville. Ever heard about the United States Supreme Court case that established the district known as Storyville? Yes, it was ordinances passed by the Common Council led by Sidney Story that segregated the district, but the neighbors fought to prevent the district in their neighborhood, just like the cemetery neighbors fought to prevent St. Louis No. 3 in that neighborhood. It's time to explore George Lote versus the city of New Orleans from 1900. The Storyville era is repeatedly defined as 1897 through 1917, 20 years of debauchery tucked away by the train station. It's sometimes reported that sex work was made legal within a specific area just outside the French Quarter, nicknamed Storyville after the alderman who wrote the ordinance, Sidney Story. However, sex work was not illegal. The ordinance required women of ill repute to live in a certain area. The new rule was the latest in a string of rules about segregating society. Storyville was the smallest area sectioned off yet for lewd and abandoned women. The district was established by City Ordinance 13032 on January 29, 1897. The boundaries were North Robertson, North Rampart, Iberville, and St. Louis. However, the ordinance outlines that no houses will be allowed on St. Louis. Quote, that from the 1st of October 1897, it shall be unlawful for any public prostitute or woman notoriously abandoned to lewdness to occupy, inhabit, live, or sleep in any house, room, or closet situated without the following limits: the south side of Custom House Street from Basin to Robertson Street, the east side of Robertson Street from Custom House to St. Louis Street, the south side of St. Louis Street from Robertson to Basin Street, provided that no lewd woman shall be permitted to occupy a house, room, or closet on St. Louis Street. Provided further that nothing herein shall be so construed as to authorize any lewd women to occupy a house, room, or closet in any portion of the city. Unquote. It was further made illegal for women to, quote, entice a young woman into a house for immoral purposes, unquote. In this way, according to Emily Landau, the city allowed itself to regulate sex work without legalizing it. The result was a lot of court cases illustrating how Storyville operated and affirming American institutions like segregation and eventually the undoing of legalized segregation. Another city ordinance, 13485, on July 6, 1897, expanded the district to 3 blocks above Canal Street and to include St. Louis Street. The first major case around Storyville was legalizing the district itself. While the municipal ordinance passed in 1897, a neighbor, George Lote, took his case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States when the city extended the district to St. Louis Street with the second ordinance. George Lote was a prominent New Orleanian. He was born just before the Civil War to a French immigrant also named George. George Sr. opened the first steam sash door and blind manufactory in New Orleans in 1847 at Canal in Carondelet, according to his grandson's biography. George Jr. was a lumber merchant whose company, Lote Lumber Manufacture Company, absorbed his father's factory. George Jr. owned the property bounded by Toulouse-Treme, St. Louis, and North Franklin, where he lived with his wife and children. He also owned this property, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. This map is from 1883, and he continued accumulating property. He claimed in his suit that St. Louis Street was his only means of reaching his property. Lote was no stranger to the court system. He was sued by many people and sued others. He also served on committees for city improvements and the Common Council from 1888 through 1892. The Civil District Court of New Orleans sided with Lote and an injunction against the district was issued. The city appealed to the state Supreme Court, who overturned the district court decision and the injunction. Storyville officially opened in 1898, and Lote's lumber was used to build the most luxurious bordellos, according to Emily Landau. Lote appealed, and SCOTUS sided with the city in 1900, officially creating the Tenderloin District, or Storyville. In the decision, the court makes it clear that this law is about segregation, not regulation. Quote, "Now this ordinance neither prohibits, absolutely, nor gives entire freedom to the vocation of these women. It attempts to confine their domicile, their lives, to certain territorial limits." It goes on, "We do not question what is so earnestly said by counsel for plaintiffs in error, that respect to the disagreeable results from the neighborhood of such houses and people. But if the power to prescribe territorial limits exists, the courts cannot say that the limits shall be other than those the legislative body prescribes. If these limits hurt the present plaintiff in error, other limits would hurt others. But clearly the inquiry as to the reasonableness or propriety of the limits is a matter for legislative consideration and cannot become a basis of judicial action. The ordinance is an attempt to protect a part of the citizens from the unpleasant consequences of such neighbors. Because the legislative body is unable to protect all, must it be denied the power to protect any?" Unquote. After the case was settled, and after his wife died in 1899, in 1901, Lote Lumber Company took possession of 18 lots near Storyville. According to Alecia P. Long in The Great Southern Babylon, this could have been to add a layer between his family's involvement with the women of Storyville. Quote, "Perhaps the properties were transferred so that Lote could continue to expand his business, but there is also the possibility that these properties, some of them clearly residential, were transferred to the family company so that rents could be collected from prostitutes without the Lote families having to be directly involved." Unquote. Lote died in 1931, but his family remained prosperous. His children and nieces and nephews are listed in the society pages of the newspaper. While it's implied by their burial in Metairie Cemetery and weddings at Holy Name of Jesus, later the Lotes are open members of carnival societies and the private men's organizations populated by only the richest, most prominent families. The Storyville case was about protecting property rights for the rich citizens who feared declining property values as a result of the district. While the Supreme Court of this era sided with the city over the rich citizen, the result was segregation for the working women of New Orleans. They were now pushed into a few blocks on the outskirts of the city and lawfully segregated by color. In French, Lote can mean the guest or the host. Perhaps George was just a guest in Storyville, expelled to become a host or landlord for the sex workers. Next, we'll remember the case of Daisy Haynes, another notorious woman of New Orleans.